So today we're going to be talking about percents, and you've probably heard percents. You've probably heard maybe if you go to the store and you hear that something is 50% off, or maybe you've heard on a test that you made an 80%. But I want you to kind of take a second and brainstorm. If you look at the top of your paper, it asks you to brainstorm where you've heard percent. So kind of think if you were to break the word apart, if you were to break it maybe into two and you were to listen to per and cent, what does it sound like? Okay, so we talked a little bit about where we might have heard the word percent. And so you might have some different ideas of what percent means to you, but when you hear the word per, this means every. And cent, we can kind of think of 100. So we're talking about every time that we have 100 of something, how many of the 100 that we have. Now our next part that we're going to talk about, it says that a percent is a part to whole ratio. Now you probably have not heard the word ratio yet, but a ratio just means that we're comparing two things. We could be comparing apples to oranges. I could be comparing miles to the time it takes me to get somewhere. I could be comparing cost to the number of people I have. But it does compare a part to a whole, and we can look at that as our numerator to our denominator. So in a percent, the whole is always going to be 100. So we just talked about in a ratio where we're talking about percents, that the whole is always 100. And that's how we're going to think about a percent for now. Now later on in the year, we are going to make some changes for that. But right now I want for you to think of any time you talk about a percent that it is out of 100. So if you look right here, our square does have 100 tiles in it. Now you always want to make sure that you count. You don't want to just guess that there's 100. We want to make sure that we have our 100 tiles. So if I look across here, I have 10 rows and I also have 10 columns going across. So this does have 100. So I see right here that it tells me that I have 50. So I want to go ahead and shade in 50 tiles. Okay, so if you were shading, you could have, this would give you 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. So we would have 50% of our tiles shaded. Now if we compared our part that's shaded, we have 50 tiles that are shaded and our whole is 100. Now as we go on, you'll hear me talk about benchmark, fractions, percents, and decimals. 50% is a benchmark, which means it's something that we should remember off the top of our head. If you think about 50% of something, another way that you might refer to it is half of something. If I say, give me 50% of your sandwich, you're going to give me half. It would not be fair if you gave me one bite. Now we have two more tiles here that we're going to do the same thing. So again, now this time I have 35. So what I want to do is start with my same process of shading in my 35 tiles. So I've got 10, 20, 30, and 35. So since this is out of 100, I can again say, because we are talking about a percent, and I'm talking about for every 100 that I have, I would have 35 shaded. So I've got 35%. If I wanted to look at the part that was shaded, it would be my 35. And again, my whole is 100. Now you should see a pattern here if we're looking. Every time our whole is going to be 100 because that's how many tiles I have total. So you can always think of your whole as also being your total. Now my part here is 10. So I'm going to shade in 10 tiles. I've got 10% and 10 over 100. Okay, so this one looks a little bit different. This one already has some tiles shaded in, and it wants to know what percent of the squares are shaded. So if we look, we can double check, make sure that this is a hundreds grid. There are 100 tiles total. If I look, I have 2 rows. So this is 10, 20, and 25. So I have 25 total squares shaded in. So I can say that I have 25%. My ratio, if you remember, a ratio is a comparison, and it wants to know the ratio of white tiles to total. This is really important that we pay attention to what the question says, because it says white tiles to total. So we're not looking at the 25 that are shaded, because these are our dark tiles. So how many white tiles do we have total? There are 75 white tiles, and we're comparing it to total tiles. And we did talk about that we have 100 total tiles. Now our ratio, later on we will talk about different ways that ratios can be written, but right now we're going to think of a ratio written in fraction form. So I'm going to compare my 75 white tiles to 100 total tiles. And it's really important anytime that we're talking about a ratio that we label our pieces. So I went ahead and wrote 75 white to 100 total. So I know every time that I have 100 tiles, 75 of them are going to be white. Now our last question here says, how are the percent and the ratio related? So if we look, and I see that 25%, that's my percent we're talking about, and I have 75 white, which is the ratio. If we were to add those together, they would actually give us our total. So a percent can also be written as a fraction. We saw that on the front of our sheet. Now, if you look right here, I went ahead and wrote percent, and I wrote again, just like what we had done on the front page, every 100, because when I'm talking about a percent, I'm talking about every time I have 100 of something. For example, in this one, I would have 70 shaded. Now, I've written it as a fraction, and that is one way that we can write it, but we can also write it in another form. So if you were going to say this fraction, you would say, some of you might say 70 out of 100, but you could also say 70 hundredths. So I want you to take just a second and think, if you've heard 70 hundredths, what's another form that we could write that in? So you should have said that if I'm going to say 70 hundredths, I can also write that as a decimal number. And if I was going to write 70 hundredths, I would write 7 zeros, showing that I have 2 numbers. I've got a number in my tenths place and a 0 in my hundredths, so this is 70 hundredths. So I want you to go ahead and take just a couple of minutes, and I want you to fill out these other 3 on your own. Okay, so for our remaining ones, our 16%, we could have written 16 over 100. And again, if I wanted to write my decimal, that is the same as 16 hundredths. You should kind of see a pattern going along here. 28% would be the same as 28 hundredths, or 28 hundredths as a decimal. 62 hundredths, or 62 hundredths as a decimal. Now for your remaining part of your notes, you are going to work through this with Miss Walker. Make sure that every time that you are thinking about a percent, that you are thinking about per 100, and every time that you think about a ratio, that you are thinking about a comparison